Welcome to Stories from History's Edges. I'm Odelia Renault, and today I want to start with something small that opens into something bigger. For today's episode, I'm sharing a short narrated chapter from Not the Same God. It's where a lot of the thinking behind this project first took shape. Everything else grows out of this. Before I read this chapter, I want to start with something current. Today, the White House announced that Iran halted hundreds of scheduled executions after direct warnings from the United States. 800 people's lives were saved today. It was not a miracle, no revelation, just pressure, threat, and military leverage. People will live or die because the people in power decided to pause. What interests me is not the pause, it's the logic underneath it. Every god working behind this story claims moral authority. Every one of them insists they stand for justice, righteousness, and order. And every one of them is perfectly willing to let people die to prove the point. When killing works, it's framed as justice. When stopping works, it's framed as mercy. The god stays clean either way. This is not unique to one religion, or one country, or one century. This is the trick. Evil is allowed, justified, or outsourced when it serves power, then explained as necessary, regrettable, or holy after the fact. That shared willingness is what lets these gods pretend they are one. The chapter you're about to hear is about that mechanism, about how evil becomes the common language, about how violence is never a failure of the system, only a tool of it. I wrote this chapter looking backward. Today just made it obvious. So here it is. The chapter, The Evil Trick from my book, Not the Same God. The problem of evil is the oldest threat to divine survival. If suffering counts as evidence, God loses authority. If God loses authority, God loses followers. If God loses followers, God dies. Every monotheistic God confronts this existential risk, and each one fails to solve it. So they adopt a strategy. Evil is reclassified. Suffering is explained. Pain is stripped of its power to indict. Once evil can no longer disqualify God, God can survive anything. That is the trick. Different gods, same survival trick. For Yahweh, evil is a disciplinary technology. Disobedience produces famine. Rebellion produces invasion. Doubt produces exile. The flood eliminates the disloyal. Plagues punish resistance. Babylon kills non-compliance. Yahweh's evil teaches humans the cost of betrayal, and then their collective suffering binds collective loyalty. Yahweh survives by making evil functional. A God who punishes survives by obedience. Jesus rebrands evil. In his system, suffering becomes proof. Death becomes testimony, and martyrdom becomes momentum. Evil no longer threatens God's credibility, it enhances it. The cross turns failure into victory. Jesus survives because a God who suffers with his followers outlives empires. Allah does not negotiate with evil. He absorbs it into his system. Nothing is random. Nothing happens without Allah's permission. Evil is pre-authorized. Under Allah, suffering becomes a test. Endurance becomes obedience, and submission becomes proof. By making all outcomes God's will, Allah eliminates dissent and secures survival by making resistance irrational. A God who actuates everything cannot be blamed for anything. That's the evil trick. Three gods, different strategies, same objective, survival. Once evil is neutralized as evidence of blame, contradictions cannot accumulate. Once contradictions cannot accumulate, rivalry stays hidden. That is how three gods sound like one. Evil is not a flaw in their systems, it is a feature that keeps them alive. That was it, friends. I hope you found it interesting. This was an excerpt from my book, Not the Same God. You can find it on Amazon or get a first edition autographed copy on my website, odeliarenault.com. Before we wrap up, let's bring today's news back into the frame. Earlier today, the White House announced that Iran has halted around 800 planned executions of protesters after repeated warnings from the United States that there would be grave consequences if the killings continued. That moment, the threat of death, the pause, the way it was justified and explained, is exactly the pattern we just explored in the Evil Trick chapter. Violence never appears without a story around it. It needs a reason and authority. It needs someone to say, this is justice, this is mercy, this is necessary, or this is inevitable. So here's the question we're left with right now in modern days. How do we recognize a God's trick when it's dressed up in the language of power, not scripture? In today's news, what is Yahweh's role? The God of covenant and commandment, invoked when moral authority is claimed. What is the role of the Father, the source of love and judgment, used to justify restraint or threat? And what is Allah's trick, the way mercy and will are wrapped together in the stories that follow the wielding of power? These aren't easy questions. They don't lead to neat answers, but history's edges tend to be the places where the patterns show themselves if we're willing to look. Thank you for listening. We'll keep pulling at it one story at a time.